Tell us, how did you get started with this private investigation?
Well, initially I had written an amateur sleuth series, and what I found was that that was very limiting because you end up with what I call the Cabot Cove syndrome, which is that you have bodies dropping in a small town and you can't really explain why that is. So I decided I wanted to make the transition to a professional investigator, and I enrolled in a program at the University of Washington in private investigation and earned a certificate, and that was how Fina was born. I don't think that just the men should be the ones who are engaged in fisticuffs, essentially. It's part of her job, and it's a big part of who she is in terms of being a Ludlow. They are a scrappy family. That's how she was raised, and she doesn't shy away from physical confrontations. I think people are often a little taken aback because she is a woman and she engages in the physical confrontations. I think if she were a man, people probably wouldn't think twice about it, but because she's a female, they are concerned for her in a way they might not be otherwise. Well, I'm from Marblehead originally, and when I was writing Fina, I had moved to the Seattle area recently, and what I found was that I didn't know Seattle well enough nor feel comfortable enough with the city to have that be the setting for the book. But I did feel that I knew Marblehead and the North Shore and Boston enough to do that in Metro West area. What I also found was that it allowed me to be home in my mind while I was writing, even though I was living in Seattle. So it was a really nice transition making that move across country, because every day when I was working in my head, I was still in the Boston area. Well, I love food, so it's something I enjoy in life, and I like to write about it. It's been very interesting to see readers' reaction to her diet. Some people are very critical, and some people wish they could have that diet. But I think part of great books take you to a place that you wouldn't necessarily go. I couldn't eat that way, and I like having a character who can.
So, one of the interesting things I heard about you is that in preparation for writing this novel, you took yourself to private eye school.
I did, and I decided that what I needed to do was to have a professional detective as my protagonist, and I thought, you know, I'd really like to know what I'm talking about, or I'd like to know what the rules are so that I could decide what rules to break. So I found a program at the University of Washington was just starting up a certificate program in private investigation, and I took the class and got my certificate, and it was taught by a defense attorney, a civil investigator, and a criminal investigator, and it was a terrific experience, really unusual, learned a lot. Had terrific guest speakers, learned about all the different subsets within private investigation that one can follow.
So did you decide to get a certificate in case writing doesn't work out?
I didn't get my license, no. I decided that I didn't aspire to actually be a PI.
I thought it sounded like an interesting fallback for you.
Well, we'll see how this goes. You never know. But I felt like I then had the solid foundation to decide that my character was going to either follow a certain protocol or not follow.
Right. Yeah. I also spotted some reference to Elizabeth Salander in a comment you made about it's easy to break all the rules or be outside the norm if you don't belong to anything, but you decided not to have a sleuth that was just out there but was part of a family.
Well, I was interested in her character, and I thought she was, such a fascinating character, but she was really born of this terrible abusive childhood and then really operates outside of kind of societal norms. And I thought, well, what about having a female character who is also independent and not completely put off by violence, but who has a family and goes to family dinners and is expected to show up at holidays and things like that. And I was interested in how do you kind of reconcile those things. Because I think most of us, the reality is we do try to balance who we are with the expectations of our family unit, or not even a family unit. It could be the company you work at, or it could be another community that you're a part of. So I really wanted to try to put her in that uncomfortable position of wanting to be a Lone Ranger, but she's not a Lone Ranger. She's a part of this family unit and loves them very much. They also drive her crazy at the same time.
But they really are an unconventional family unit, and I did think that the morality, and somewhat shifting morality of the whole story, made it particularly interesting. It's a family of lawyers.
It is, and that's actually one of the things I looked at in the private investigation course. Was I went into that course having a particular mindset about personal injury lawyers and medical malpractice lawyers, not a particularly positive perspective. And what was interesting was that the civil investigator in particular, she works a lot for the lawyers you see advertising on television and those types. And what she, there you go. What she said was that there are some people who they're in an accident that's not their fault and they have no safety net, and that these lawyers actually provide a service and they enable them to take time off from work to get physical therapy or rehab, and then they don't lose their jobs, and then their kids don't lose a home. And so that was kind of eye-opening to me, and that was what attracted me to the idea of creating this family, was that in a way I had my own bias and I wanted to kind of play with that and see, I didn't feel like I could just dislike them because of what they did, because I had heard firsthand about some of the benefits they actually provide for some people.
Well, they can. I'm still trapped in an older mode when there was a much more gentlemanly aspect to the profession, and lawyers and doctors actually did not advertise them.
How long did it take you for writing inception to completion?
Now, it's a simple question for you, but it's not a simple question for me, because I was writing, when I was experiencing the amateur sleuth issue, I was writing a different series, and I actually had an agent and it wasn't selling. And so I started writing what is now Loyalty, and I wrote about 50 pages, and I sent it to my agent at the time, and she said, oh, I really like it, but can you make it a little grittier, a little darker? And I said, sure, I can do that. So I wrote Loyalty, and I sent it to her, and she said, yeah, it's too gritty, it's too dark. And I said, oh, you're gonna make my head explode. So I had that moment where I thought, do I do a new manuscript or do I get a new agent? And I got a new agent, which was the right thing to do. I would say it was about a year to write it. And then there were various kind of rounds of editing. And for the next one, the contract is for a year. I mean, basically it was, from July to July is when it's supposed to be done, and then come out the following year. So it feels fast to me. I don't feel like I have a lot of time where I'm sitting around twiddling my thumbs. But I also I'm very disciplined about sitting down and actually getting the work done.
Do you do that in the morning? Are you a morning person, or more any time of the day?
More any time, and I usually just have a certain number of pages that I try to get done. But part of what I like about writing is having the flexibility to, if I have to go do an errand in the middle of the day, that I can do that. So I'm not someone who sits at my desk at 9 and won't get up until noon. I just feel like, okay, these are the pages and you need to get them done. And I'm good at that. I think, people always say I could never do that because they get so distracted at home, and I think if you were prone to that, it might be more difficult.
Well, and as you spend more time promoting and so forth, you have less time for writing. That's the deadly trap that people fall into when they become successful, as the amount of time they have to actually write shrinks.
So I worked in various corporate jobs where writing was the focus. So I worked in an interactive company, and I did a lot of employee communications. And then before I was writing kind of full time, I worked at Harvard in the HR department, writing basically. So it was all kind of, it was technical writing. It was pretty dry. And I also did some training at the same time, and then I kind of morphed into doing that on a consulting basis and then trying to write also. The other thing that was really useful was when we first moved to Washington, I did a screenwriting program at the University of Washington, and that was fascinating. And I actually feel like it was terrific training, even if I have no interest in writing a screenplay, just because you learn a lot about story structure. And even, again, if you decide to throw it all out the window, at least you have really a good sense. It teaches you to be incredibly frugal with your words, because it's 120 pages and that's it. You can't spend a lot of time on description. So that I thought was very useful and was a really good education that I applied then to the fiction writing. I try to get it all out there, and I use a post-it system because I'm very visual and I like to be able to look up on the wall and see everything, and I like to be able to move things around before I actually move them around in the document. But I think you have to be really brave about ripping things apart. And I can remember in the screenwriting class I'd written some pages, and then I told my instructor I got rid of them and changed something, and he said, "Oh, didn't that just break your heart?" And I said, "No, not really." And I think if you grow too attached, then that can be kind of paralyzing. I try to start with an idea, and the way I think about it is it has to be roomy. So the idea has to have enough places to go that you're not gonna back yourself into a corner, and it has to have enough facets to explore. So the idea of loyalty, I liked the idea that it was thinking about loyalty to her job and loyalty to her family and to her community, and loyalty to different people within the family, because it's not just Pat, how she responds to them. So I think that's really important, and that's what I've also tried to do in the second manuscript, is to start with something that feels roomy. I don't really know a better way to describe it, but kind of something that's porous in a way, so that you have it can grow. And in terms of the plot, I know who did it. I know where I want it to end up, and as I go, I kind of plot out the next, 50 pages. And what I find is that I can't sit down if I don't have an idea of where I'm going, but a lot happens when you sit down that you haven't planned for. So to me, it's kind of a balancing act of the two things. But I guess Tony Hillerman never knew. I had heard he didn't know where his books were going.
I know lots of others.
I can't imagine that.
Are there any mystery writers you like to read, or other writers?
I love Sue Grafton. I love Elizabeth George. I'm always anxious to get her books. I've recently been on kind of a bender of Peter James.
The Brighton series?
The Brighton series.
The 10th Roy Grace coming right in a moment.
But you have to have a storyline that's interesting. I mean, you have to care. I always feel like if I'm bored by it, then why wouldn't a reader be bored by it? So I always try to think about what can be exciting, or if you think you're going to zig, you should zag, and those kinds of things. So I do try to make sure that neither suffers, either the character development or the plot.